There are moments in life when we witness cruelty so deep it changes us forever. In the frontier town of Hollow Creek, they kept a woman in a cage and called her wild, untamable, less than human. The townsfolk gathered to mock her suffering, placing bets on her survival like she was nothing more than a wounded animal. Then a mountain man named Silas Cord rode down from the high country. He was quiet, weathered, and he paid her price without hesitation. The town laughed as he led her away, certain she'd be his ruin. But in the month that followed, something happened that would shake Hollow Creek to its core. What could one man's simple act of mercy reveal about an entire town's shame? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hollow Creek wasn't always a place where human beings were kept in cages. There was a time, old-timers would tell you, when it had been different, when neighbors helped neighbors through hard winters, when a man's word meant something, when the church bells on Sunday morning called folks to something better than themselves. But that was before the silver played out in the nearby mines, before the railroad passed them by for a route 20 miles south, before desperation turned good people into something they wouldn't have recognized in a mirror. The town sat in a shallow valley where Hollow Creek, barely more than a trickle by late summer, wound between hills covered in scrub pine and sage. The main street was a quarter-mile of rutted dirt, flanked by weathered buildings that leaned like old men, tired of standing. There was Mackenzie's Saloon, the largest structure in town, with its false front painted a fading red. The general store, run by a Norwegian couple named the Larsens, who'd lost 2 sons to fever and hadn't smiled since. The blacksmith's shop, where Tom Brennan still did honest work when he wasn't drinking away memories of the war. A church with a steeple that listed slightly to the east, presided over by Reverend Howard Pritchard, a man who could quote scripture while counting cards with equal facility. And then there was the sheriff's office, where Dalton Mercer kept order in the way a man keeps order over a pack of dogs, with enough force to maintain his position, but not so much that the dogs forgot they were hungry. Mercer had been a cavalry sergeant once, and he still wore his blue coat with the yellow stripe, though it was stained now with years of tobacco juice and moral compromise. He was a big man, running to fat in his middle years, with a handlebar mustache he waxed with pride and small eyes that calculated the profit in every situation. It was Mercer who'd arranged for the cage to be built in the town square. Not because there was any law requiring it, but because certain types of entertainment drew people in from the outlying ranches and mining camps, and people with money in their pockets were good for business. The cage stood near the old hanging tree, itself a relic from when Hollow Creek had pretended to swift justice, constructed of iron bars scavenged from the abandoned mine. It was perhaps 8 feet square, barely tall enough for a person to stand upright, with no shelter from sun or rain or the cold winds that came down from the mountains. That's where they kept her, the woman with no name, or rather, too many names, none of them given with kindness. The townsfolk called her the Wild One or the Savage, or worse things that decent people wouldn't repeat but whispered anyway. She'd been brought in 6 months earlier by a pair of traders who dealt in furs and anything else that turned a profit. Where they'd found her, how she'd come to be in their possession, these were questions no one asked too carefully. Sheriff Mercer had paid them $20 and figured he could make it back 10 times over through the curious and the cruel. She had the look of mixed heritage, dark hair that hung in matted tangles past her shoulders, skin the color of aged copper, eyes that held both European green and something older, something that had looked upon these lands long before any white man. Her clothes were little more than rags, a torn dress that might once have been doe-skin but was now barely decent. She was thin, half-starved, marked with scars on her arms and back that spoke of violence no human being should endure. But it was her eyes that people remembered. Even caged, even broken by whatever horrors had brought her to this place, there was something in those eyes that made certain men uncomfortable. A kind of witnessing, a refusal to look away or look down. The Reverend Pritchard called it the devil's own defiance. Clara Mackenzie, who'd seen more of life's cruelties than most and judged them less harshly, called it something else entirely, the last ember of a fire that wouldn't quite go out. Clara ran the saloon with a firm hand and a sharp eye for human nature. She'd been a handsome woman once, and at 45 still carried herself with a dignity that made even the roughest cowhands watch their language in her presence. She'd come west after burying a husband to cholera, and discovered she had a talent for business and no taste for remarrying. She served whiskey and kept rooms upstairs for the girls who worked for her, and she paid them fair and protected them fierce. In a town that had lost its way, Clara Mackenzie held to her own code with a stubbornness that earned respect even from those who whispered about her behind their hands. It was Clara who tried, in her way, to intercede. She'd gone to Sheriff Mercer after the first week, when it became clear the woman in the cage was being treated worse than any animal. "This isn't right, Dalton," she'd said, standing in his office with her arms crossed. "Whatever she's done, whatever she is, she's still a human being." Mercer had leaned back in his chair, boots up on his desk, and smiled that oily smile of his. "She's property, Clara. Legal and proper. You got a bill of sale says otherwise." "Since when do we trade in people?" "Since always, if you go back far enough. Besides, she's half savage anyway. Probably happier outdoors than in." Clara had left before she said something that would make an enemy she couldn't afford. But she'd started leaving food when no one was watching. Bread, cheese, a canteen of clean water. Small mercies that probably meant the difference between life and death, though the caged woman never acknowledged them, never showed by word or gesture that she recognized kindness when it came. The town had grown accustomed to the cage, the way people grow accustomed to anything if they see it long enough. They walked past it on their way to the store or the saloon, barely glancing at the figure huddled inside. Children dared each other to get close, to poke sticks between the bars until their mothers called them away. On Saturday nights, when the miners and ranch hands came in with money and whiskey courage, bets were placed on how long she'd last. Some said she'd die before winter. Others said she was too mean to die, that she'd outlast them all out of pure spite. It was on one of those Saturday afternoons, when the autumn sun hung low and the air carried the first hint of winter cold, that Silas Cord rode into Hollow Creek. He came down from the high country as he did once a month, leading a pack mule loaded with furs and riding a gray horse that had seen as many years and hard miles as its owner. Silas was a mountain man of the old type, the kind that was already becoming rare as the frontier closed and the wild places shrank. He stood 6 feet in his moccasins, lean and weathered like an old tree bent by wind but not broken. His hair was dark, shot through with gray hanging past his collar. His face was lined deep by sun and weather, and his eyes were the pale blue of glacial ice. He spoke little and needed less, making his living through trap lines in winter and hide hunting in summer. He'd been coming to Hollow Creek for supplies for the better part of 10 years, and in all that time, most folks couldn't say they knew much about him beyond his name and his trade. He was honest in his dealings, paid in coin or trade goods, never caused trouble, and never stayed longer than necessary. But on this particular day, Silas Cord did something that no one expected. He stopped his horse in the town square, directly in front of the cage, and sat there for a long moment, looking at the woman inside. She looked back, those green-brown eyes meeting his without fear or pleading, just that steady witnessing that made most people turn away. Silas dismounted slowly, tied his horse to the rail, and walked into Sheriff Mercer's office. Those who saw him go felt a stirring of something, curiosity, perhaps, or the sense that something was about to shift in the ordinary flow of their days. Inside the office, the conversation was brief. Silas asked one question. "What's her price?" Mercer, sensing opportunity, named a figure that would have bought a good horse and saddle. Silas counted out the money and gold coin without haggling, signed the bill of sale that made the transaction legal by the standards of the day, and walked back outside. The crowd that had begun to gather watched in silence as Silas unlocked the cage. Mercer had followed him out, handed over the key with a smirk that suggested he expected entertainment from this. The woman didn't move at first, even when the door swung open. Silas stepped back, giving her space, and waited with the patience of a man who'd spent years watching game trails. Finally, slowly, she emerged. She stood on legs that trembled from disuse, squinting in the afternoon light. Silas took off his coat, a heavy wool affair lined with fur, and held it out. She stared at it, at him, with something that might have been suspicion or might have been incomprehension that anyone would offer warmth without demanding payment. "For the ride," Silas said, his voice quiet and rough from disuse. "Gets cold in the mountains." She took the coat after a long moment, wrapped it around herself. Silas walked to his horse, mounted and held out his hand. The woman looked at that hand, at the faces of the townspeople gathered around, at Sheriff Mercer's mocking grin. Then she took Silas's hand, and he pulled her up behind him with a strength that belied his lean frame. As they rode out of Hollow Creek, heading toward the mountains that rose purple and pine dark in the distance, the townspeople began to laugh and make their predictions. She'd knife him before they reached his cabin. She'd run off into the wilderness and die of exposure. She'd prove more trouble than any woman was worth, savage or civilized. Only Clara Mackenzie, watching from the doorway of her saloon, wondered if maybe, just maybe, they were all wrong. There was something in the way that Mountain Man had looked at the woman in the cage, not with desire or possession, but with something simpler and rarer. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition of one human being seeing another and deciding that was enough. The sun was setting as Silas and his unnamed passenger disappeared into the tree line, heading up into country where the air grew thin, and the only laws were the ones a man carried in his own heart. The journey into the mountains took the better part of 3 hours, following a trail that grew fainter with each mile until it was nothing more than a thread of disturbed earth winding between towering pines. The woman, Sarah, though Silas didn't know her name yet, sat rigid behind him on the horse, her hands gripping the saddle rather than his waist, maintaining as much distance as the arrangement allowed. She said nothing, and Silas didn't press. He'd learned long ago that silence was its own kind of language, and this woman had reasons beyond counting to trust nothing and no one. The air grew colder as they climbed, carrying the clean scent of pine resin and the mineral smell of stone. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals invisible to the eye. Somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled, the lonely, haunting call echoing across the valleys. The woman flinched at the sound, her whole body tensing, and Silas felt it through the saddle. "Just an elk," he said quietly. "Bull calling for his harem. They do that this time of year." She didn't respond, but some of the tension eased from her frame. Small mercies, Silas thought. Small steps. His cabin sat in a clearing carved from the forest by a long-ago fire, now regrown with new pines still young and slender around the edges. A creek ran nearby, the headwaters of the same hollow creek that gave the town its name, though up here it was clear and cold and full of trout. The cabin itself was solid work, built from logs he'd cut and notched himself, with a stone chimney that drew clean and a roof that had weathered 12 winters without leaking. There was a small barn for the horse and mule, a shed for stores and pelts, and a quiet that settled over everything like fresh snow. Silas dismounted and offered his hand again. This time she ignored it, sliding down from the horse on her own, stumbling slightly when her feet hit the ground. Her legs had been confined too long in that cage. She caught herself against the horse's flank, steadied, and looked around with the wariness of a creature that had learned to map every escape route before anything else. "Cabin's there," Silas said. nodding toward the structure. "You can sleep inside or out, your choice. There's a creek just past those trees if you want to wash. I'll see to the animals and get a fire going." She stared at him, those remarkable eyes searching his face for the trap, the angle, the moment when mercy would reveal itself as just another form of cruelty. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from disuse, shaped by an accent that carried traces of languages older than English. Why? Just that one word, but it contained multitudes. Why buy me? Why bring me here? Why speak as if I have choices? Why pretend kindness? Silas met her gaze steadily. "Because no living creature should be caged like that. Because I had the money and you needed out. That's all." "Nothing is ever all," she said, and there was a lifetime of bitter knowledge in those words. "Fair enough," Silas acknowledged. "Then add this. I got no expectations beyond you being here until you figure out what you want to do next. You're free to leave whenever you choose. I won't stop you, won't follow you, won't claim any rights over you despite what that paper says. But if you stay as a free woman, not a servant or anything else. Clear?" She studied him for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the creek without another word, still wrapped in his coat. Silas watched her go, then set about his evening tasks. He unsaddled the horse and mule, gave them grain and water, stacked the furs in the shed. He built a fire in the cabin's hearth and set water to boil, made a simple stew from dried venison and root vegetables, put coffee on to brew. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, he heard her moving around outside. He left the cabin door open, positioned a lantern just inside so its light spilled out in welcome without forcing her to step into its source. He ate his portion of stew, left the pot hanging over the fire to stay warm, and settled into his chair with the worn leather journal he kept for observations, notes on weather patterns, animal movements, the changing seasons. Hours passed. The fire burned down to coals. Outside, he heard her gathering wood, the small sounds of someone trying to move quietly but unpracticed in these particular woods. He resisted the urge to go help, understanding that right now her independence mattered more than efficiency. Eventually, he banked the fire, left the door open, and stretched out on his bed. A simple affair of rope and canvas with wool blankets. Through the open door, he could see the small fire she'd built for herself at the edge of the clearing, could see her silhouette sitting beside it, wrapped in his coat and a blanket she must have taken from the barn. She was watching the cabin, watching him, waiting for whatever came next. Silas closed his eyes and let sleep take him, trusting that tomorrow would unfold as it needed to. He woke to find her gone from the fireside, and for a moment wondered if she'd run after all. Then he heard movement from the barn and relaxed. She was checking the animals, or perhaps just seeking shelter that felt safer than the cabin. He rose, stoked the fire back to life, made coffee and cornmeal mush with honey. When she appeared in the doorway, cautious as a deer at a salt lick, he gestured to the pot. "There's food if you want it. Coffee, too." She came inside for the first time, moving along the wall, keeping maximum distance between them. Her eyes catalogued everything. The rifle above the door, the knives on the table, the windows, the layout. Survival calculations made automatic by necessity. Silas poured coffee into a tin cup, set it on the table with the pot of mush and a spoon, then took his own breakfast outside to sit on the stump he used for splitting wood. Giving her space. Letting her eat without being watched. When she emerged, the cup and bowl were empty. She set them on the bench by the door and looked at him across the clearing. "I'm called Sarah," she said. "Sarah Whitehorse." The name came out like something precious she was testing, seeing if it would hold up in the air between them or shatter like the fragile thing it had become. "Silas Cord," he replied. "Pleased to make your proper acquaintance, Sarah Whitehorse." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but a loosening of the hard set of her mouth, as if hearing her name spoken with respect was water to parched earth. The days that followed fell into a careful rhythm. Sarah slept in the barn at first, then after a week in the cabin but pressed against the far wall, wrapped in blankets Silas had given her. She was healing physically, the wounds on her arms and back scabbing over, the hollows in her cheeks filling out from regular meals. But the deeper wounds would take longer. Silas knew that from his own experience. She began to help without being asked. Fetching water from the creek, gathering firewood, watching how he prepared food and then taking over some of those tasks. They communicated mostly through gesture and demonstration. Silas would show her how to bank a fire for overnight, how to tell when the coffee was ready, how to read weather in the sky. Sarah proved quick to learn and quicker to remember. It was on the 10th day that Sheriff Mercer rode up, accompanied by 2 men Silas recognized as ranch hands from the Double J spread. Sarah was inside the cabin when they arrived, but she appeared in the doorway at the sound of horses, her whole body coiled with tension. "Morning, Cord," Mercer called out, staying mounted, a calculated show of authority. "Thought I'd ride out, check on how you're managing with your purchase." "Managing fine," Silas said, his tone flat. "Appreciate the concern." "See, that's the thing," Mercer continued, smiling that oily smile. "I've had some complaints from concerned citizens. Questions about propriety, about whether a civilized man ought to be keeping an Indian woman out here without proper documentation, without the oversight of Christian values." "She's not Indian," Sarah said from the doorway, her voice cutting clear across the clearing. "I'm half Cheyenne, half Irish, and I'm not being kept. I'm here by choice." Mercer's smile widened. "Well now, she speaks. That's something. But the law's still the law, and there's procedures for this sort of thing. Civilizing influences, educational requirements, moral guidance. I can read and write in 3 languages," Sarah interrupted. "Can you?" One of the ranch hands snorted, quickly stifled. Mercer's face reddened. "That's as may be, but nothing," Silas cut in, his voice quiet but carrying an edge like fresh-stropped steel. "You sold her to me legal and proper, signed papers and all. Now you're saying those papers aren't worth the ink they're printed with?" "I'm saying there's ways these things should be done. Proper marriages, for instance. Legal unions recognized by the territory. Otherwise, people talk, and when people talk, sometimes the law has to get involved." The threat hung in the air, clear as mountain water. "Do it our way, on our terms, or we'll find reasons to cause trouble." Silas felt anger kindle in his chest. Not the hot, quick rage of youth, but the cold fury of a man who'd seen too much injustice dressed up in righteous language. "How long do we have to consider this advice?" Silas asked, keeping his tone level. "Oh, I'd say a week ought to do it. Give you time to come to town, see the circuit judge, make things proper. Otherwise—" Mercer shrugged. "Well, can't say what might happen. Territorial authorities take a dim view of irregular situations." He touched his hat in mock courtesy and turned his horse, the ranch hands following. As they rode away, Sarah stepped down from the cabin, came to stand beside Silas. "He means to use me against you," she said quietly. "He'll find some law, some regulation, some excuse. That's what men like him do." "I know. You should send me away. Before they make trouble you don't deserve." Silas turned to look at her fully. In the morning light, with her face clean and her hair beginning to regain its luster, with food and rest softening the sharp edges of starvation, she was striking. But that wasn't what held his attention. It was the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the strength that imprisonment hadn't broken, the dignity that no amount of degradation had quite destroyed. "You want to go?" he asked. She held his gaze. "No." "Then we'll figure this out. Together." That evening, as they sat by the fire, inside now, the distance between them gradually shrinking, Sarah told him what Mercer's words meant. Marriage as protection, as a legal shield. The hypocrisy of men who'd caged her, now demanding proper Christian union. The mockery of it all. He's right about one thing, Silas said after she'd finished. A legal marriage would make it harder for them to interfere. Wouldn't be real, wouldn't have to be. Just a paper arrangement for the law's sake. You'd keep your freedom, your choices. But you'd have a legal name, legal standing. Make it harder for them to claim any authority over you. Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of too many betrayals, too many false promises. And what would you want from this arrangement? Nothing beyond what we have now. Separate quarters, if that's what you prefer. Your own life. I'm not looking for a wife in anything but name, Sarah. I'm just looking to keep the wolves from the door. She turned to face him, searching his weathered features in the firelight. Why? Why do this for a stranger? For someone the whole town calls savage? Because, Silas said, and his voice carried a sorrow that came from old wounds never quite healed. 12 years ago, I couldn't save my own wife and daughter when cholera came through. Couldn't do anything but watch them die and bury them in ground too frozen to dig proper graves. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help someone who needed it, I wouldn't let the moment pass. So here's the moment, here's the chance, and here's me, asking if you'll accept it. The silence stretched between them, filled with the crackle of burning wood and the distant call of a night bird. Finally, Sarah nodded. On one condition, she said. Name it. You teach me everything you know about living in these mountains, how to hunt, track, survive, how to be free the way you are. So if I ever have to run again, I'll know how. Silas extended his hand across the space between them. Deal. Sarah took his hand, and for the first time since he'd found her in that cage, she almost smiled. It was a small thing, fragile as new ice on a pond, but it was there. Outside, the first snow of autumn began to fall, soft and silent, covering the world in white. February brought the deepest cold, the kind that made trees crack like rifle shots and froze breath before it left your mouth. But it also brought a closeness born of necessity and something deeper, genuine companionship. The cabin had become a world unto itself, a small universe where two damaged souls found ways to heal each other through presence and patience. One evening, as wind rattled the shutters and snow built drifts against the walls, Silas finally spoke of the thing he'd been carrying for 12 years, the guilt that had driven him into these mountains and kept him there. I should have known, he said, staring into his coffee cup. About the cholera. There were signs in the last town we passed through. People getting sick, dying. I should have kept us moving, found clean water, something. Instead, I made camp by a creek that must have been contaminated upstream. I killed them as surely as if I'd poisoned them myself. Sarah set down her beadwork and looked at him steadily. Did you know the water was bad? No, but did you have reason to suspect? Not exactly, but I should have. Silas. Her voice was firm, cutting through his spiral of self-recrimination. You can't punish yourself for not knowing something unknowable. Cholera comes like lightning. It strikes where it will. You didn't bring it down on them. I was supposed to protect them, and I was supposed to protect my family, Sarah said quietly. I hid while they died. I was 14 years old, and I hid in a root cellar because I was afraid. Should I carry that as guilt forever? Silas looked at her, saw the pain in her eyes, the shared understanding of survivor's burden. That's different. You were a child, and you were human, mortal, limited by the same flesh and knowledge as any man. She moved closer, sat beside him in a way she wouldn't have dared weeks ago. You've been punishing yourself by staying alone up here, haven't you? Living half a life because you think you don't deserve a full one. The truth of it hit him like cold water. Maybe. I understand that, Sarah said. After what happened to me, after being caged and beaten and treated like an animal, I wanted to die. I prayed for it some nights, but I didn't. And eventually I realized that surviving meant something. It meant I owed it to my parents, to that boy who died defending the village, to everyone who didn't make it. I owed it to them to actually live, not just exist. Silas felt something crack in his chest, some long frozen thing beginning to thaw. How do you do that? How do you make peace with it? I don't know yet, Sarah admitted. But I think it starts with allowing yourself to feel things again. Joy, connection, hope. All the things that make being alive worthwhile. They sat in silence, shoulders touching now, and Silas realized that somewhere in the past months, Sarah had become more than a responsibility or a companion. She'd become essential to his daily existence in ways he hadn't experienced since Mary's death. Not the same. Nothing would ever be the same as that, but important in its own right. Tell me more about your mother, he said, wanting to know her fully, to understand all the pieces that made up Sarah Whitehorse Cord. And so she did. She spoke of Running Deer, her mother, who'd been a medicine woman among her people, who'd known every plant and its properties, who'd chosen to marry the Irish trader Emmett Whitehorse because she loved him and because she believed that bridges between peoples were possible. She spoke of growing up between two worlds, learning to navigate both Cheyenne tradition and her father's Irish Catholic heritage. My mother used to say that being of two peoples made me twice as strong, Sarah said, and for the first time there was no bitterness in her voice when she spoke of her heritage. I didn't understand it then. I just wanted to belong fully to one world or the other. But now, she gestured around the cabin at the life they'd built together. Maybe she was right. Maybe being able to stand in multiple worlds is a kind of strength. You are strong, Silas said. Stronger than anyone I've ever known. What you've survived, what you've overcome, with help. Sarah interrupted gently. I survived with help. Your help. Clara's. Even Judge Morrison's. Strength isn't just about enduring alone, it's also about knowing when to accept help, when to trust. She was right, of course. Silas had spent 12 years convinced that isolation was penance, that he didn't deserve connection after failing to protect his family. But looking at Sarah now, seeing the light in her eyes that hadn't been there when he'd first freed her from that cage, he understood that healing wasn't a solitary journey. It was something that happened between people, in the spaces they created together. On impulse, he reached out and took her hand. Not the brief, comforting gesture she'd offered him, but something more deliberate, an acknowledgement of what was growing between them. Sarah didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled around his, and they sat like that as the fire burned low and the storm raged outside. Two people who'd survived loss and learned to carry it, finding in each other a reason to hope again. The moment was interrupted by a sound that didn't belong to the storm, the whinny of a horse in distress from the barn. Both of them were on their feet instantly, Silas grabbing his rifle, Sarah pulling on her coat. They ventured out into the blizzard, following the rope line to the barn. Inside, they found the gray horse spooked and agitated, and the reason became clear quickly. A mountain lion had tried to get in through a gap in the roof boards, drawn by the smell of the animals and the promise of easy prey. The cat was gone now, frightened off by their arrival, but the damage was done. The horse had kicked through a stall board, and the mule was trembling with fear. They worked together to calm the animals, to patch the roof as best they could in the storm, to secure everything against another attempt. Sarah's knowledge of animal behavior proved invaluable. She sang softly in Cheyenne, a song her mother had taught her for calming frightened creatures, and gradually the horse settled. We'll need to hunt that cat, Silas said once they were back in the cabin, warming themselves by the fire. Can't have it stalking the livestock. I'll come with you, Sarah said, and when Silas started to protest, she fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. You've been teaching me to track, to shoot. This is part of that learning. He wanted to say no, to keep her safe and protected, but he recognized the look in her eyes. She wasn't asking to be coddled. She was asserting her right to be a full partner in this life they were building. All right, he agreed. But we do it smart. No unnecessary risks. The next morning, when the storm had passed, they set out together on the cat's trail. The snow made tracking easy, large paw prints leading up into the rocks above the cabin. Silas moved quietly, and Sarah matched him step for step, absorbing everything he showed her about reading sign, about understanding animal behavior, about patience in the hunt. They found the lion's den in a rocky overhang, and Silas made the shot. Clean and quick, the animal dying without suffering. Sarah helped dress the kill, her hands steady even when the work was bloody. They would use everything, the meat for food, the hide for clothing or trade, the claws and teeth for decoration or medicine. As they worked, Sarah spoke. My mother would have said we honored this animal by using all of it, by taking only what we needed. The soldiers who killed my family, they didn't understand that. They saw us as savages because we lived close to the land, because we took what we needed and gave thanks for it. But who are the real savages? The ones who take only what they need, or the ones who destroy for sport? Both sides have done terrible things, Silas said carefully. That's the tragedy of it. Good people and bad on all sides, and the innocent caught in the middle. Like always, Sarah agreed. They returned to the cabin with the lion's meat and hide, and that evening, as they worked together to tan the hide and prepare the meat for smoking, Sarah asked, Do you ever think about leaving here? Going somewhere else? Sometimes, Silas admitted. But there's peace in these mountains. Simplicity. Out there. He gestured vaguely toward civilization. It's all complications and compromises. And loneliness, Sarah added softly. You were lonely before I came. Yes, he said, meeting her eyes. I was. I was lonely too, even in that cage, surrounded by people. Maybe especially then. She paused in her work, her hands stilling on the hide. I'm not lonely anymore. Neither am I. The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. Both recognized that something had shifted, that the careful boundaries they'd maintained were beginning to blur, not with impropriety, but with genuine affection. That night, Sarah didn't retreat immediately behind her curtain. Instead, she sat with Silas by the fire, and when she finally stood to go to bed, she paused and bent to kiss his forehead, a gesture of tenderness that made his heart ache with its sweetness. Good night, Silas. Good night, Sarah. Winter was beginning to release its grip, and with the first hints of spring came the understanding that what had begun as protection and necessity was transforming into something neither of them had planned, but both were beginning to want. Love, quiet and patient, was taking root. March brought the thaw, and with it, signs that the outside world hadn't forgotten them. Tom Brennan arrived on horseback one afternoon, his expression grim, carrying news from Hollow Creek that couldn't wait for the monthly supply run. There's trouble coming, he said without preamble, accepting the coffee Sarah poured for him. Mining company out of Denver's been buying up land claims all through the territory. They've got their eyes on this whole valley, including your parcel, Silas. Silas frowned. My claim's solid. Been filed proper for 12 years. That's not stopping them. They're finding technicalities, old survey errors, claiming prior rights. Already pushed out 3 families down near the creek mouth. Tom pulled out a folded paper from his coat. They left this tacked to my shop door, asking about you. Surveyors will be up here within the month. Sarah took the paper, reading it carefully. Her literacy had improved dramatically over the winter, and she studied the document with a lawyer's attention to detail. They're claiming this land overlaps with a mineral rights grant from 1868, before your homestead claim. That's impossible, Silas said. I checked all that before filing. Doesn't matter if it's true, Tom said heavily. They've got lawyers and judges in their pocket. Sheriff Mercer's already on their payroll, been getting monthly payments to look the other way while they pressure people into selling. Let me guess, Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anger. The payments started around the time a certain woman showed up in a cage. Tom nodded. Clara, Thinks the whole thing was a setup from the start. Keep the town distracted with entertainment while the company moved pieces into place. Mercer gets rich, the company gets land, and nobody questions too hard because they're too busy being awful to notice being robbed. Sarah stood abruptly, moving to the window. Silas could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched. So that cage, I was just a distraction, something to keep the town occupied while they were being stolen from. Looks that way, Tom said quietly. I'm sorry, Sarah. She turned back, and there was fire in her eyes. Don't be sorry, be angry. They used me, they used all of us, and now they think they can just take whatever they want because they have money and we don't. That's generally how it works, Silas said, though his jaw was tight. Then we change how it works. Tom looked between them, something like hope kindling in his expression. Clara thought you might say that. She's been gathering information, documenting everything she can. The company's not as careful as they think. They've made mistakes, left trails. What kind of mistakes? Sarah asked. Forged signatures on some of the sales. Surveyors who aren't actually licensed. Payments to Mercer that he didn't declare to the territorial government. Tom pulled out more papers. Clara's good with numbers, always has been. She's been tracking it all. Sarah took the papers, spreading them on the table. As she read through them, her expression shifted from anger to something more calculating. This is good. This is evidence of fraud, but we'd need to get it to someone who can do something about it. The territorial governor's in Denver, Tom said. Honest man, by all accounts. Doesn't take kindly to corruption. That's a week's ride each way, Silas pointed out. In this weather, maybe more. So we wait for better weather, gather more evidence, and then we go, Sarah said decisively. We don't just fight to keep this cabin, Silas. We fight to expose what they're doing to everyone. Silas looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the strategic mind working through possibilities. This was the woman who'd survived being caged and sold, who'd endured things that would have broken most people. She hadn't just survived. She'd emerged stronger, sharper, ready to fight not just for herself, but for others. You're right, he said, but we need to be smart about this. They've already shown they don't play fair. Over the next week, they planned. Tom rode back to town with instructions for Clara to keep gathering evidence, but to be careful. Sarah spent hours poring over the documents, making notes, finding patterns. She had a gift for seeing connections others missed, for understanding how systems worked and where they were vulnerable. One evening, as they worked by lamplight, Sarah looked up from the papers. There's something else. Something in these land grants. What? The original mineral rights grant they're claiming. It's signed by Territorial Judge Emmett Whitehorse. She paused, her hand trembling slightly. My father. Silas leaned over to look. Sure enough, there was the signature, dated 1868. Your father was a territorial judge. He never told me. I knew he dealt in land, that he had connections with the territorial government, but Sarah's voice caught. He must have been important. More important than I realized. What happened to him? You said your family was killed in a massacre, but he wasn't there that day. He was traveling, dealing with some legal matter in Denver, when he came back and found what had happened. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering. He went to the territorial authorities, demanded justice. I heard him shouting at soldiers before they took me away. Then I never saw him again. I thought he'd been killed too, or that he'd abandoned me. Maybe he didn't abandon you, Silas said gently. Maybe he was trying to get justice, and something happened to him. Sarah nodded slowly, and when she opened her eyes, they were bright with unshed tears and something fiercer, determination. Then we find out what happened. We go to Denver, we present this evidence, and we ask questions about the mining company, about my father, about all of it. That night, for the first time since winter began, they heard the sound of running water, the creek flowing free again as the snow melted. Spring had truly arrived, and with it, the time for action. Sarah stood in the doorway of the cabin, looking out at the stars. Silas came to stand beside her, and without thinking, she leaned into him, letting his arms settle around her shoulders. "We're going to fight this," she said quietly. "Yes. It's going to be dangerous. They've already killed people, if what Tom says is true." "I know. And you're still willing to stand with me? Even though this isn't really your fight. It's mine. It's about my father." "Sarah." Silas interrupted, turning her to face him. "Everything about you is my fight now. Your past, your future, your battles. I stand with you in all of it. Not because I have to, but because I choose to." She looked up at him, and in the starlight, he could see the emotion playing across her features. "When did this happen?" she whispered. "When did what happen? When did our marriage of convenience become—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Real," Silas suggested. "Yes, real." He thought about it, about the gradual accumulation of moments. Shared meals, shared silences, shared griefs and hopes. "I don't know exactly when. Somewhere between teaching you to track and learning your mother's songs. Somewhere between winter and spring." Sarah reached up, her hand cupping his weathered face. "I never thought I'd want this. After everything that happened, I thought I'd never want anyone to touch me again, never want to be vulnerable. But you made me feel safe enough to want again." They kissed then, tentatively at first, then with growing certainty. It was nothing like the transaction that had passed for romance when Sarah had been property. This was choice, mutual and freely given, born of respect and understanding and genuine affection. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling, small, private smiles that spoke of promises being made without words. "We should probably discuss," Sarah began. "Living arrangements," Silas finished. "Expectations? Boundaries? All of that." They talked long into the night, two people who'd learned that honesty was the foundation of trust, working out the details of a relationship that had begun in a cage and grown into something neither had expected. The curtain came down that night, not dramatically but simply, because it was no longer needed. Outside, spring continued its work of renewal, and inside the cabin, two hearts learned to beat in rhythm with each other. The journey to Denver took 9 days through mountain passes, still choked with late snow, and across plains beginning to green with spring grass. Silas and Sarah traveled light, carrying the evidence Clara had gathered wrapped in oilcloth and tucked safely in saddlebags. They moved carefully, aware that the mining company might have eyes watching for trouble. Tom had given them the name of a lawyer in Denver who'd helped homesteaders before. Jacob Fisher, a German immigrant with a reputation for fighting corporate overreach. They found his office above a dry goods store on Larimer Street, a cramped space overflowing with law books and case files. Fisher was a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, but his eyes were sharp and his handshake firm. He listened intently as Sarah and Silas laid out their case, spreading Clara's documents across his desk. "This is excellent work," Fisher said, studying the papers. "Your friend, Clara, was it? She has a mind for detail. These payment records to Sheriff Mercer alone would be enough to trigger an investigation." "But is it enough to stop them from taking our land?" Sarah asked. Fisher frowned. "That depends on the validity of their mineral rights claim. If they can prove prior ownership, even fraudulent homestead evictions might stand up in court while that gets sorted out. We'd need to challenge the original grant." "It was signed by Territorial Judge Emmett Whitehorse," Sarah said, and Fisher's head snapped up. "Whitehorse? Are you certain?" "Completely. Why?" Fisher stood, moving to a filing cabinet and pulling out a thick folder. Because Emmett Whitehorse has been a puzzle for 15 years. He was one of the most respected territorial judges, known for his integrity and fairness. Then, in 1869, he filed a formal complaint alleging corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. Bribes, land fraud, even murder. Before his complaint could be investigated, he disappeared. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Disappeared how? Officially, he went on a trip to inspect land claims in the Montana Territory and never returned. Presumed killed by hostile Indians or accidents of travel. Fisher looked at her intently. Unofficially, there were always whispers that he was murdered to silence him. His complaint named several prominent men, including the territorial secretary and 2 major mining company executives. One of those companies wouldn't happen to be the Continental Mineral Consortium? Silas asked. Fisher's eyebrows rose. As a matter of fact, yes. How did you... He stopped, really looking at Sarah for the first time. What's your name, miss? Sarah Cord. Born Sarah Whitehorse. The silence that followed was profound. Fisher sat down heavily, removing his spectacles to clean them, a gesture that seemed more about buying time to think than actual necessity. Judge Whitehorse had a family, he said slowly, a Cheyenne wife and a daughter. They were killed in a massacre in 1869, a tragedy that many believed was orchestrated to silence the judge by attacking what he loved most. The daughter's body was never found, but she was presumed dead with the others. I'm not dead, Sarah said, and her voice was steady despite the emotions churning inside her. I'm very much alive, and I need to know everything you know about my father. Fisher spent the next hour telling them what he knew. Emmett Whitehorse had been appointed territorial judge in 1865, had married Running Deer in 1866, had earned a reputation for fairness that made him enemies among those who profited from the territory's lawlessness. His investigation into land fraud had uncovered a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of government, a scheme to invalidate Indian land claims and small homesteads through forged documents and legal technicalities, then transfer that land to mining companies for pennies on the dollar. Your father documented everything, Fisher said, pulling out more files. These are copies of his original complaint. He had evidence of forged signatures, falsified surveys, bribed officials. But before he could present it to the federal authorities, your family was attacked. And he disappeared trying to avenge them, Sarah asked, or trying to protect his evidence. There were rumors he'd hidden copies of his documentation, that he was planning to go directly to Washington with proof, but he never made it. Fisher paused. There was one other thing. Judge Whitehorse had recently updated his will. He left everything to his heirs and descendants, with specific instructions that his land holdings and legal papers were to be held in trust for his daughter, should she ever be found alive. What land holdings? Silas asked. Fisher opened another file, and Sarah gasped. The list was extensive, thousands of acres throughout the territory, purchased legally over years of careful investment, including, notably, the entire valley where Silas's cabin stood. Your father owned that land, Fisher explained. He bought it from the territorial government in 1867, seeing it as a place where his family might live safely, away from the corruption of the settlements. He never had a chance to move you there before everything ended, Sarah finished softly. She looked at the documents, at her father's signature on deed after deed. So the mining company's claim is fraudulent. More than fraudulent. It's built on the very corruption your father died trying to expose. Fisher leaned forward. Sarah, if we can prove your identity, if we can establish you as Judge Whitehorse's legal heir, you don't just own that cabin. You own most of the land the Continental Mineral Consortium has been trying to steal. Their entire operation in your valley would be invalid. The implications settled over them like snow. Sarah wasn't just fighting for a small homestead. She was the rightful owner of land worth a fortune, and she had legal standing to challenge the very corruption that had destroyed her family. They'll fight this, Silas said quietly. If they killed to silence your father, they won't hesitate to kill me, Sarah finished. I know. Fisher nodded gravely. Which is why we need to be very careful about how we proceed. We'll need proof of your identity beyond your word. Witnesses, documents, anything that establishes you as Emmett Whitehorse's daughter. The bill of sale, Sarah said suddenly. The one Sheriff Mercer used when Silas bought me. It listed me as the woman known as Sarah Whitehorse. If Mercer knew my name, if that's documented, then he knew who you were all along, Silas finished, anger hardening his voice. He caged the daughter of a territorial judge, sold her like property, all while working for the same company that probably killed her father. We'll need that document, Fisher said, and we'll need to get Judge Morrison's testimony about your marriage, Clara's records, anyone who can verify your identity and the timeline. They spent 2 more days in Denver, gathering additional evidence, making copies of Fisher's files, building their case. Sarah pored over her father's papers, reading his notes, seeing the man he'd been through his careful documentation and passionate arguments for justice. On the 3rd day, Fisher arranged a meeting with the territorial governor, a stern man named Harrison who listened to their presentation with growing outrage. If what you're telling me is true, Harrison said, then we're looking at a conspiracy that's been running for 15 years, that's cost lives and stolen land throughout this territory. It's true, Fisher assured him. I have documentation. Harrison looked at Sarah. And you're prepared to testify to all of this, to face these men in court and in public? It won't be easy. They'll try to destroy your credibility, dredge up everything you've suffered, use it against you. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. They took my family. They stole my identity. They caged me and sold me like an animal. And they've been stealing from honest people for years while hiding behind law and respectability. Yes, Governor, I'm prepared to testify. I'm prepared to fight them with every legal tool available, and I won't stop until they're exposed. Harrison nodded slowly. Then you'll have the full support of this office. I'll assign federal marshals to investigate, and I'll issue an injunction halting all Continental Mineral Consortium operations in the territory, pending a full legal review. He stood, offering his hand to Sarah. Your father was a good man and a good judge. I knew him. He'd be proud of you. Sarah shook his hand, and only Silas saw the tears. She blinked back. They left the governor's office with more than they'd come for. Not just protection for their small cabin, but the tools to dismantle the entire corrupt system that had destroyed Sarah's family. But as they rode out of Denver, Silas noticed the men watching them from across the street. Noticed the riders who fell in behind them as they left town, maintaining distance but clearly following. We're being watched, he said quietly. I know, Sarah replied. They know who I am now. They know what I represent. We could go somewhere else. Take the evidence. Give it to Fisher. Let the law handle it from here. Sarah shook her head. No. We go back to Hollow Creek. We face this head on. Because this isn't just about land or money anymore, Silas. This is about every person that town failed, including me. This is about making sure no one else ends up in a cage because people looked the other way. They rode hard, trying to stay ahead of whoever was following them. But on the 6th day, as they climbed into the mountains approaching Hollow Creek, they found the trail blocked by a group of armed men. Continental Mineral Consortium enforcers, by the look of them, hard men with dead eyes and guns they clearly knew how to use. The leader, a scarred man with tobacco-stained teeth, smiled coldly. Mrs. Cord, we've been waiting for you. Company would like a word before you get any foolish ideas about going public with accusations. Silas's hand moved toward his rifle, but Sarah touched his arm, stopping him. They were outnumbered 6-2, and a gunfight would end only one way. What kind of word? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the danger. The kind where you sign over all claims to any land your father might have owned, and in exchange, you get to keep living. Simple business transaction. And if I refuse? The man's smile widened. Then accidents happen. Mountains are dangerous places. People disappear all the time. Sarah looked at the men surrounding them, at the guns pointed their way, at the casual cruelty in their leader's eyes. Then she looked at Silas, and something passed between them, an understanding, a shared determination. No, she said simply. No, I won't sign anything. You'll have to kill me. But know this. The territorial governor already has copies of all my father's evidence. Federal marshals are already investigating. You can kill me, but you can't stop what's coming. It was a bluff, or at least partially one. The governor had the evidence, but the investigation would take time, and without Sarah's testimony, it might stall entirely. But the enforcers didn't know that. Their leader's smile faded. He raised his gun, pointing it directly at Sarah, and that's when the shot rang out from the trees above them. The shot came from Tom Brennan's rifle, positioned in the rocks above the trail. The enforcer leader's hat went spinning off his head, and the message was clear. The next shot wouldn't miss. The enforcers scattered for cover as more shots rang out from multiple positions. Clara Mackenzie emerged from the tree line to the left, her own rifle steady. Behind her came half a dozen townspeople, armed and determined. On the right, more appeared. Farmers, ranchers, even old Mrs. Larson with a shotgun that looked older than she was. Seems like you're the ones outnumbered now, Clara called out. And unlike you fellas, we know these mountains. Every trail, every hiding spot, every way in and out. The enforcers found themselves surrounded by angry citizens who'd finally decided which side of history they wanted to be on. Their leader looked from face to face, calculating odds and finding them wanting. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his gun. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward his horse. "You're right," Sarah replied. "It's not over. It's just beginning. And every crime your company has committed, every life you've destroyed, every piece of land you've stolen, all of it's going to be laid bare for the courts and the public to see. You can tell your bosses that Sarah Whitehorse Cord is coming for them, and she's bringing the law with her." The enforcers rode away, and the townspeople lowered their weapons. Clara approached, a grim smile on her face. "Figured you might run into trouble," she said. "Tom's been keeping watch on the trails. When he saw them heading up to intercept you, we gathered everyone we could trust and followed." Sarah looked around at the gathered people. Some of the same ones who'd walked past her cage without protest, who'd placed bets on her suffering, but they'd also stood up when it mattered, had risked themselves to protect her. "Thank you," she said simply. Mrs. Larson stepped forward, tears on her weathered face. "It's we who should thank you, for having the courage to fight when we didn't, for being stronger than all of us." They rode back to Hollow Creek together, a small army of ordinary people who'd found their courage. But as they approached the town, they saw smoke rising from multiple buildings. The enforcers had struck there first, burning the church, the general store, and Clara's saloon in retaliation. The town was in chaos. Reverend Pritchard stood in the street, his hypocrisy forgotten in the face of real loss, watching his church burn. The Larsons wept over their store, a lifetime of work reduced to ash. And Clara stood silent before the ruins of her saloon, her face carved from stone. Silas moved to help organize bucket brigades, to save what could be saved, but Sarah went directly to Sheriff Mercer's office, where she found him packing to flee. "Going somewhere?" she asked from the doorway. Mercer spun, his hand going to his gun, but Sarah already had hers drawn. Silas's spare pistol, and she held it with the confidence of someone who'd been well taught. "You can't prove anything," Mercer blustered. "I'm the law here." "You were never the law. You were just another thief in a badge." Sarah stepped into the office, and her eyes fell on the filing cabinet in the corner. "That's where you keep the records, isn't it? All the paperwork from the last 15 years? She moved to the cabinet, keeping her gun trained on Mercer, and pulled open a drawer. Inside were files upon files, bills of sale, property transfers, and there, near the back, a folder labeled simply Whitehorse. Sarah's hand trembled as she pulled it out. Inside was everything, the bill of sale from when Mercer had purchased her from those traders, listing her full name. Correspondence with Continental Mineral Consortium discussing the judge's daughter and the need to keep her neutralized and anonymous. Even a copy of a telegram from 1869 reporting Emmett Whitehorse's death, not by accident, but by assassination. "You knew," Sarah said, her voice shaking with fury. "You knew who I was. You knew my father had been murdered, and you put me in a cage anyway." "It was business," Mercer said weakly. "Nothing personal." "It was my life." The sound of horses outside drew her attention. Federal marshals, sent by the governor, arriving faster than anyone had expected. Sarah kept her gun on Mercer as she called out the window. "In here, I've got Sheriff Dalton Mercer and evidence of a 15-year conspiracy." The marshals arrested Mercer, confiscated his files, and took statements from Sarah, Silas, Clara, and anyone else who could provide testimony. The lead marshal, a weathered man named Coleman, listened intently as Sarah laid out everything they'd discovered. "This is bigger than land fraud," Coleman said when she'd finished. "This is conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, corruption of public officials. We're going to need you to testify before a territorial grand jury." "I'll testify," Sarah said. "But first, we need to secure the town. Those enforcers will be back, and next time, they'll bring more men." Coleman nodded. "I'll send for reinforcements from Denver. In the meantime, I've got 5 deputies and whatever townspeople are willing to help." "They'll help," Clara said, joining them. She'd been organizing efforts to fight the fires, and her face was smudged with soot. They're done being afraid, done being victims. Over the next 3 days, Hollow Creek transformed into an armed camp. The townspeople fortified buildings, established watches, stockpiled supplies. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, not because she sought leadership, but because people naturally turned to her. She'd survived the worst they could imagine and come out stronger. If she could stand up to the company, so could they. Tom Brennan's blacksmith shop became an armory, producing iron bars for windows and reinforcements for doors. The women organized food preparation and medical supplies. The men drilled in basic defensive tactics under Silas's guidance. He'd fought in the Mexican War years ago, and that experience proved valuable. Sarah spent long hours with Marshal Coleman, going through Mercer's files, building the case against Continental Mineral Consortium. The evidence was damning: years of systematic fraud, bribery, intimidation, and violence. Her father's investigation had barely scratched the surface. But she also found something else in those files. A letter from Emmett Whitehorse, written to his daughter and never sent. Mercer must have taken it from her father's belongings after his death. Sarah read it alone in what remained of Clara's saloon, tears streaming down her face. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have failed to protect you as a father should. I am leaving tomorrow to present my evidence to the federal authorities in Washington, and I fear I may not return. Know that everything I've done, every risk I've taken, has been in the hope of creating a world where you can live freely, where your mixed heritage is celebrated rather than scorned, where justice means something real. I have left instructions with my lawyer that all my property is to be held in trust for you. Use it wisely, my daughter. Use it to build something better than what I leave behind. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and you carry the best of both your parents in your heart. Never forget who you are. Sarah Whitehorse, daughter of Running Deer and Emmett Whitehorse, heir to 2 proud peoples and beholden to none who would diminish you. I love you with all my heart. If we meet again, it will be my greatest joy. If we do not, know that you were the finest thing I ever helped bring into this world." It was signed simply, "Your father." Sarah folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her medicine pouch. next to the beads her mother had made. She'd lost so much, but she had this now, proof that she'd been loved, that her father had died fighting for something that mattered. When she emerged from the saloon, she found Silas waiting. He didn't ask about the tears on her face, just pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried for the father she'd lost and the life she might have had. "We're going to finish what he started," she said when she could speak again. "I know. It's going to be dangerous. They'll come with everything they have. I know that too. And you're still with me." Silas pulled back to look at her, his weathered face gentle with love. "Sarah, I'm with you to the end of this, whatever that end looks like. You're my wife, truly now. Your fights are my fights. Your battles are my battles." She kissed him then, there in the street with half the town watching, a kiss that promised partnership and passion and a future they'd build together if they survived. That night, scouts reported movement in the hills. Continental Mineral Consortium was gathering forces. Not just enforcers, but hired guns from as far away as Texas and Missouri. They were preparing for a siege, planning to crush Hollow Creek's resistance and eliminate the threat Sarah represented. The townspeople gathered in the church. Miraculously, the stone walls had survived the fire, even though the roof was gone. Standing under the open sky with stars bright overhead, they took stock of their situation. "They'll come at dawn, most likely," Silas said, pointing to a map of the town. "They'll try to overwhelm us with numbers, burn us out, or force a surrender." "How many are we talking?" someone asked. "Scout counted at least 40 guns," Tom Brennan replied. "Maybe more." The number settled over them like a weight. They had perhaps 20 people capable of fighting, plus the 5 marshals. Long odds, and everyone knew it. "We could evacuate," Clara suggested. "Get everyone to safety, wait for more marshals from Denver." "And let them burn the town completely?" Mrs. Larson protested. "This is our home." "Better a home lost than lives," Clara countered. Sarah stood, and the room fell silent. "We don't have to choose between safety and home," she said. "We can fight smart instead of fighting hard. My father taught me something about the law. It's not just about being right. It's about making sure everyone knows you're right. The company thinks they can eliminate me and suppress the evidence. But what if the evidence is already public? What if by the time they attack, the whole territory knows what they've done?" "How do we do that?" Coleman asked. "We send riders to every newspaper, every town within a week's travel. We make copies of the evidence and spread it everywhere. We make sure that if they kill us, it won't matter. The truth will already be out there, and they'll have proved our case by murdering us to silence it." Clara smiled. "Make them choose between letting you live and exposing themselves as murderers." Exactly. They spent the night preparing. Riders left carrying copies of documents, heading to newspapers in Denver, Cheyenne, Salt Lake City. Letters went to territorial officials, to federal authorities, to anyone who might care that a conspiracy of murder and fraud had been running unchecked for 15 years. And in Hollow Creek, they prepared for the fight of their lives. Not just for land or money, but for something more important. The principle that ordinary people deserve justice, that corporations couldn't simply murder their way to profit, that a town that had lost its way might still find redemption. As dawn approached, Sarah stood with Silas on the roof of the general store, watching the horizon. She wore the dress Mrs. Larson had given her, the gold ring from Judge Morrison, and her mother's medicine pouch. She carried her father's legacy and her own hard-won strength. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "thank you for seeing me when I was invisible, for treating me like a person when everyone else saw property, for loving me when I thought I'd never feel safe enough to love anyone." "Whatever happens," Silas replied, taking her hand, "we face it together." The sun rose, painting the mountains gold and red, and from the east they saw the dust cloud rising. The company's army was coming Kermit's men saw the reinforcements coming and began to waver. These were hired guns, not soldiers. They fought for money, not conviction, and the odds had suddenly turned against them. Several threw down their weapons immediately, others started edging toward their horses. But Kermit himself was made of harder stuff. Or perhaps he knew that surrender meant the rope for the murders he'd committed. Either way, he spurred his horse forward in a desperate charge, heading straight for the church, straight for Sarah. Silas saw him coming and stepped into the street, rifle raised. His first shot took Kermit's horse, sending the hired killer tumbling. But Kermit came up firing, and one of his bullets caught Silas in the side, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. Sarah screamed, a sound of pure rage and grief. She ran into the street even as bullets kicked up dust around her feet. Kermit raised his gun to finish Silas, but Sarah's shot caught him in the shoulder, her second in the chest. The hired killer fell, his weapon clattering to the dust beside him. The remaining company men surrendered then, seeing their leader down and federal marshals surrounding them. The battle for Hollow Creek was over. Sarah dropped her rifle and ran to Silas. He was alive, conscious but bleeding badly. The bullet had caught him in the ribs, angling through but missing anything vital. Clara was already there with bandages, Mrs. Larson with water, the townspeople gathering around the man who'd helped save them. "Told you," Silas gasped, managing a pained smile. "I'm right where I choose to be." "You stubborn fool," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face as she helped Clara bandage the wound. "You could have been killed." "So could you. Didn't stop you from running into the street. That's different." "How?" "Because I can't lose you. Not now. Not after everything." The lead federal marshal approached as they worked. "Mrs. Cord, I'm Marshal Holbrook, sent by Governor Harrison. I have warrants for the arrest of everyone connected to the Continental Mineral Consortium's operations, and I've been authorized to take testimony regarding your father's murder." Sarah looked up at him, her hands still pressed to Silas's wound. "Can it wait until I'm sure my husband isn't going to bleed to death?" Holbrook smiled slightly. "Yes, ma'am, it can wait." They carried Silas to what remained of Clara's saloon, laid him on a table while the town's closest thing to a doctor, a veterinarian named Perkins, who'd sewn up more men than horses over the years, tended his wound. Sarah stayed by his side, holding his hand, refusing to leave even when others tried to give them privacy. Outside, the marshals rounded up the surviving company men. The newspapermen set up their equipment and began interviewing everyone who'd witnessed the battle, documenting the conspiracy, taking down Sarah's story for publications across the territory. By evening, the story was being set in type. "Daughter of murdered judge exposes 15-year conspiracy" would be the headline in tomorrow's Denver Post. As night fell and the wounded were cared for, the dead buried with what dignity could be managed, Sarah finally left Silas's side to speak with Marshal Holbrook. She gave him everything: Mercer's files, her father's papers, Fisher's documentation, her own testimony. The marshal's expression grew darker with each revelation. "This goes higher than we thought," he said when she finished. "Some of the names in these documents, territorial officials, federal appointees, even a congressman. This will cause earthquakes." "Good," Sarah said simply. "Let it shake until everything rotten falls down. You understand you'll need to testify at multiple trials? That this will take months, maybe years to fully resolve? That you'll be questioned, challenged, that they'll try to destroy your credibility any way they can? I understand, and I'll be there for every trial, every hearing, every deposition. I'll tell the truth until everyone's sick of hearing it. Because my father died for this, and I won't let his death mean nothing." Holbrook nodded with something like respect. "Your father would be proud." Sarah returned to Silas as the stars came out. He was sleeping now, the fever from his wound controlled by Perkins's ministrations. She sat beside him, her hand in his, and let herself feel the weight of everything that had happened. She'd come to Hollow Creek in a cage, nameless and broken. She'd been bought by a stranger and expected nothing but more cruelty. Instead, she'd found safety, partnership, love. She'd discovered her true identity, her father's legacy, her own strength. She'd stood against corruption and won, not alone but as part of a community that had found its conscience. The iron cage still sat in the town square, a reminder of what they'd all been. Tomorrow, Sarah thought, they'd melt it down. She had an idea for what it should become, something that rang with hope instead of imprisonment. But tonight, she simply sat with her husband, grateful for breath, for heartbeat, for the promise of tomorrow. They'd survived, against all odds. Despite everything, they'd survived, and that was enough. 6 months later, autumn painted the mountains in gold and crimson once again. Sarah stood in the town square of Hollow Creek, watching as Tom Brennan put the finishing touches on the new schoolhouse. The building was simple but sturdy, built with lumber milled from Sarah's land and paid for with a portion of her inheritance. Above the door, ready to be installed, hung a bell, cast from the iron of the cage that had once held her. The trials were ongoing. Continental Mineral Consortium had been dissolved, its assets seized, its executives facing charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy to commit murder. Sheriff Mercer had testified against his former employers in exchange for a lighter sentence, and his testimony had brought down 2 territorial officials and exposed corruption reaching into the Federal Department of the Interior. The newspapers had called it the biggest scandal in territorial history, but Sarah's focus had shifted from retribution to rebuilding. She'd established a land trust with her father's holdings, ensuring that the valley would be protected from future exploitation. She'd funded the school, a new church to replace the one that burned, expansion of Clara's saloon into a proper hotel. Most importantly, she'd created a legal aid fund to help homesteaders fight fraudulent land claims, ensuring that what happened to Hollow Creek wouldn't happen elsewhere. Silas emerged from the general store, moving with only a slight hitch from his healed wound. He carried supplies for their cabin. They still lived in the mountains most of the time, coming to town weekly but keeping their sanctuary in the high country. Some things didn't need to change. "Tom says the bell will be ready to hang tomorrow," Silas reported, sliding an arm around Sarah's waist. "He wants you to ring it for the first time." "Seems appropriate," Sarah said, leaning into him, from cage to calling children to learn. "My mother would have appreciated the symbolism." They walked together toward Clara's new hotel, where they'd stay the night before returning to the cabin. The town had changed in the months since the battle. Some of the old families had left, unable to reconcile their past complicity with their present consciences. But new people had arrived, homesteaders drawn by fair land prices, merchants seeking honest commerce, families looking for a fresh start in a place trying to do better. Not everyone had forgiven Sarah for forcing them to confront their shame. Reverend Pritchard, before he left town in disgrace, had preached a bitter sermon about troublemakers and outside agitators. A few others still muttered that she'd brought violence and chaos to their peaceful town. But most had come to understand that the peace they'd enjoyed was built on looking away from cruelty, and that kind of peace wasn't worth keeping. Clara met them at the hotel entrance, her face creased with a genuine smile. "Got a letter for you, Sarah." "From Washington." Sarah opened it and read quickly, her expression shifting from curiosity to wonder. "It's from the Secretary of the Interior. They're naming the valley after my father, White Horse Valley, and they're establishing a permanent federal land office here to prevent future fraud." "Your father's legacy," Silas said quietly. "Our legacy," Sarah corrected. "His investigation, my testimony, this town's stand. All of it together." That evening, the town gathered for what had become a weekly tradition, a communal meal in the town square where everyone contributed something and stories were shared. It was Mrs. Larson's idea, a way of rebuilding community through breaking bread together. As they ate, people told stories. Tom Brennan spoke of his plans to expand the blacksmith shop, to train apprentices in honest metalwork. The Johnsons discussed their successful harvest, their gratitude for fair water rights, finally enforced by law. Young Billy Wade, arm healed from his bullet wound, announced his engagement to the new schoolteacher, a woman from Denver who'd heard about Hollow Creek's transformation and wanted to be part of it. When it came time for Sarah to speak, she stood and looked around at the gathered faces. 6 months ago, I stood in front of you as property, as something less than human in the eyes of law and custom. Some of you looked away, some participated. Some felt guilty but did nothing. The square grew quiet, people shifting uncomfortably. But Sarah's voice was gentle, not accusatory. And then you chose differently. You stood with me when it would have been easier to let me face the company alone. You risked your homes, your lives, your futures for something you believed was right. That choice, that moment of choosing justice over convenience, that's what saved this town. Not my father's money, not the marshals. Your choice to be better than you had been. She paused, her hand finding Silas's. I came here broken, and this town broke me further. But it also gave me the chance to heal, to fight, to become whole again. It gave me Silas and Clara's friendship and a community that proved people can change if they choose to. So yes, we've been through darkness, but look at what we've built in the light. The applause was quiet, but genuine. Sarah sat down, and the conversation resumed, lighter now, turned toward futures instead of pasts. Later, as Sarah and Silas prepared to retire to their room, Clara pulled Sarah aside. You know you could live anywhere now, Clara said. With your inheritance, you could go to Denver, San Francisco, even back east. Build a life somewhere that doesn't carry all these hard memories. Sarah looked out the window at the mountains, rising dark against the stars. Those mountains are where I learned to be free again. This town is where I learned to fight. This valley is my father's legacy and my mother's heritage. Why would I go anywhere else? Clara smiled. Just checking. I'd miss you if you left. You're stuck with me, Sarah assured her. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't water down the whiskey. The next morning, the whole town gathered for the bell dedication. Sarah climbed the ladder to the schoolhouse roof with the bell rope in her hands. Below, children waited to enter the school for the first time. Adults stood ready to begin building something better than what they'd had. Sarah looked at the bell. Once the bars of a cage, now reforged into something that would call young minds to education, that would mark celebrations and mourn losses, that would ring out across the valley as a promise that cruelty could be transformed into hope. She pulled the rope, and the bell sang, clear and bright and true. The sound carried across Hollow Creek, up into the mountains where she and Silas had found each other, across the valley her father had tried to protect and that she would continue to defend. It was the sound of redemption, of justice, hard won, of a town that had lost its way, finding it again through the courage of a woman who refused to stay caged. Sarah Whitehorse Cord rang the bell 3 times, and with each peal, the mountains seemed to echo back. Remember, honor, hope. She descended the ladder to find Silas waiting, his weathered face warm with love and pride. They walked hand in hand toward the mountains, toward home, toward a future they would build together in a valley that finally lived up to its promise. Behind them, children's voices rose in excited chatter as they entered the school. Ahead, the mountains stood eternal and welcoming, and in Sarah's medicine pouch, her mother's beads rested beside her father's letter, the past and present woven together, creating something new. She had been called Untamable, and perhaps that was true. Perhaps the wildness they'd seen was simply the refusal to be less than human, the strength to survive, the courage to fight back. If that was wildness, Sarah thought, then let the mountains ring with it. Let every valley echo with the truth that some things, dignity, justice, love, should never be tamed.